All right, so today we are diving into something pretty interesting, a commentator's take on Kamala Harris doing an interview on Fox News.
Yeah, it's election year, and you've got this prominent Democrat going on a network that's known for a pretty conservative audience. So,
Yeah.
there's a lot of potential for some fireworks there.
Definitely. And this commentator does not disappoint. They
Yeah.
really jump right into it. The first thing they bring up is something that Bill Clinton supposedly said while he was campaigning for Biden down in Georgia.
Right.
And this is what's interesting. They're saying that Clinton linked the deaths of Laken Riley to what he called an illegal immigrant, who he said should have been vetted. And they're using this to sort of place the blame on the Biden administration and specifically their border policies.
Right.
So it's interesting how they're using this statement right from the get-go to kind of frame the rest of their analysis.
Yeah. Well, it's a way to sort of prime the pump and establish a narrative even before you actually get into the meat of what Harris is saying in this interview. They're already sort of, you know, linking a very tragic event back to the administration's policies, even if it's indirectly.
Right.
And we know that that's a very common tactic to try to sway public opinion.
Absolutely. It's that association, right away.
Yeah.
So then they actually move into some of the things that Harris said and how she responded to this kind of blame being put on the administration for the situation at the border. We don't hear the exact question, but they criticize her response, saying that she deflected and put the blame on Trump for the lack of a border security bill.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, it seems like a pretty classic political tactic, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's a very tricky thing.
Yeah.
You're constantly on the defensive as a politician, and you're trying to address accusations without getting too bogged down in the details or, admitting direct fault. So one of the ways to sort of sidestep that is to try to shift the focus and highlight your opponent's shortcomings as a way to kind of deflect from the accusations that are being thrown your way. How effective it is, I think, is really up to the individual listener to decide, but it's definitely a common tactic.
It is, and this commentator clearly has an opinion about it.
Yes.
But it's not just what she said, but they also focus on how she was presenting herself during this interview.
Okay.
And they seem to get particularly fixated on her earrings.
Interesting.
Like they're very focused on her jewelry choices, suggesting that it's a way to distract from the issues at hand.
Well, this is unfortunately something that we see quite often, and I think particularly with women in politics, there is often this focus on their appearance, whether it's conscious or not. And it's often used as a way to kind of undermine their credibility or to shift the focus away from the arguments that they're making and focus more on these sort of superficial aspects.
Yeah.
And it's a very subtle but very pervasive form of sexism that I think is just deeply ingrained in our society.
It is, and it's something to be really mindful of, I think, not just in political commentary, but really any media that we're consuming.
Absolutely. Always ask yourself, is this about the message or is this about the messenger? And if it seems to be more about the messenger, what does that potentially reveal about the person who's delivering that commentary?
Exactly. Okay, so we've got the blame game, we've got the focus on appearance, and then this commentator decides to shift gears a little bit and bring in another really sensitive topic, which is Biden's age and his mental fitness.
Right.
And this is where things get really interesting, I think, because
Yeah.
they criticize Harris for not directly addressing these concerns about Biden's age,
Okay.
saying that instead she focuses on his experience, which they view as a way of dodging the real issue.
Right.
And it brings up this really important question of when do these legitimate concerns about a candidate's ability to serve in office, when do those concerns potentially veer into ageism?
Yeah, that's the real tightrope walk, right? Because it's not always clear cut. It's not always black and white.
It's a fine line.
Exactly. And it's a conversation I think we need to be having more and more, particularly as our population ages. We are going to have people who are older in positions of power. And so how do we have that conversation? How do we frame it in a way that is both respectful of someone's age and experience, but also acknowledges that there are very real demands to certain roles, particularly in politics?
Absolutely. So this commentator then uses that conversation about age to kind of segue into this whole critique about crowd sizes at rallies.
Okay.
And they basically pose this question: if Trump is as bad as Harris is claiming, why is he still so popular?
Right.
And then they go on to compare the size of Trump's rallies versus the size of some of the rallies that Biden and Harris have held, framing it as if that's like evidence of their relative appeal.
Yeah.
What do you make of that kind of comparison?
Well, I mean, I think it's a very bold statement to make because political popularity is so incredibly complex. And to try to boil it down to just one factor like that, I think is a little bit misleading.
Right.
You've got media narratives at play, you've got economic anxieties, people's lived experiences, identity politics. All of these things are playing a role in why someone might be drawn to a particular candidate or policy.
Yeah, so many factors.
It's never as simple as just saying, oh, big crowds equal a good politician or, a bad politician has small crowds.
It's much more nuanced than that.
Yeah, it's about really digging deeper and understanding the context and not just taking these surface level observations
Exactly.
at face value.
Right. And speaking of observations, this commentator makes a point of talking about the demographics of the people who were at this particular Harris rally.
Okay.
They even go so far as to bring up a packed Megan Thee Stallion concert as a point of comparison.
Wow.
And their tone is, let's just say it's interesting.
Oh,
because
interesting.
they're almost suggesting that there's something off about the people who showed up to support Harris.
Yeah, and this is where I think the analysis starts to take a little bit of a potentially problematic turn.
Yeah.
Because that comparison, even if it's not intentional, it does play into some pretty harmful stereotypes.
Right.
It suggests that certain demographics are only drawn to entertainment and not serious political discourse.
It's like they're saying, oh, certain groups of people they don't care about politics. That's not their thing.
Right, and it's a very dangerous assumption to make because what you're essentially saying is that those voices are less important,
Right.
less relevant in shaping our political landscape. And I think that kind of thinking can be incredibly damaging, especially in a democracy where we want everyone's voice to be heard.
Absolutely. It's a good reminder that representation matters, in every aspect of our society, including politics. And when you limit who has a seat at the table, we all lose out.
100%. Because when we create space for diverse voices and diverse perspectives, we end up with a much richer and ultimately more representative democracy.
Well said. All right, so let's move on, because this commentator then dives into a very specific policy issue, which is the use of taxpayer dollars for gender reassignment surgery. And they specifically bring up the case of prison inmates and illegal immigrants, and they highlight Harris's stance on this, framing it as yet another example of her being out of touch with the average American.
Yeah, this is where things get really complicated because now you're talking about a convergence of multiple different hot-button issues. You're talking about healthcare access. You're talking about prisoner rights. You're talking about immigration policy. And it's very easy to get caught up in the emotional arguments surrounding an issue like this. But I think there are valid points to be made on all sides of this debate.
Yeah, it feels like this is one of those issues that often gets used as a wedge to kind of divide people rather than an opportunity to have a more nuanced conversation about the complexities involved.
I agree, and unfortunately, it's much easier to reduce complex issues down to these very sort of simplified sound bites and quick jabs.
Right.
But if we really want to have a productive dialogue about these things, we have to be willing to engage with the nuances and understand the different perspectives at play and challenge our own assumptions.
Yeah, it's about moving beyond those kind of knee-jerk reactions and really grappling with the complexities of these issues.
Exactly, because that's where the real learning happens. And that's where we can start to potentially bridge some of these divides and find common ground, even on issues that seem incredibly polarizing.
Well said. Now, speaking of polarization, this commentator goes on to accuse Harris of not really listening during the interview,
Okay.
claiming that she's more interested in pushing her own talking points.
Right.
They specifically cite her response on immigration as an example, saying that she seemed evasive and unwilling to really engage with the interviewer's questions directly.
This is always a tough one because I think anytime you're dealing with a political interview, there's this inherent tension between wanting to stay on a message,
Right.
but then also genuinely engaging with challenging questions.
Yeah.
And it's a tough balance to strike, especially in a media landscape where, sound bites reign supreme.
Oh, absolutely. Like they say, one good soundbite can make or break a politician.
Right, and that becomes the focus. And so that also shapes, I think, how people approach these interviews.
Right.
They have to be strategic. They know that anything they say can be taken out of context, can be used against them.
Absolutely.
So it's almost like you're playing this game of chess where you're trying to anticipate the interviewer's moves while simultaneously trying to get your message across in a way that is effective,
Right.
compelling.
It's a tough spot to be in.
It is, and this commentator seems to be suggesting that Harris is not playing the game very well.
Right.
That she's getting caught up in the back and forth and losing sight of the bigger picture.
Which, of course, plays into their overall negative assessment of her performance.
Right. They're building a case piece by piece, and they're doing that by, taking carefully selected moments,
Right.
certain interpretations to try to shape a very specific narrative.
And that's why it's so important for us as, the viewers, the listeners, to be aware of those tactics, to be really critical consumers of this information, and to seek out multiple perspectives before we form our own opinions.
Absolutely. Don't just take one person's word for it, even if they sound credible, even if they have a large following. Do your own research. Look at things from multiple angles and come to your own conclusions.
Exactly. All right, so with that in mind, let's take a closer look at some of the specific examples that this commentator uses to support their argument.
One of the things they point to is a moment where the interviewer brings up Trump's record on this same issue, almost as if to say, this contradicts what you're saying. And they really try to frame it as Harris being caught in a lie, or at least a factual inconsistency.
Yeah, and they really hone in on that moment, suggesting that she seemed flustered or unsure of herself when she was confronted with this, supposed contradiction. And it's interesting how much emphasis they put on her demeanor.
Right.
Even down to like her word choice and her tone of voice.
Well, this is a very common tactic that's used to undermine someone's credibility, rather than just focusing on the content of what they're saying. They're bringing in these very subjective interpretations of body language and tone of voice as a way to sort of prime the viewer to think, okay, well, this person just can't be trusted, even if what they're saying on the surface seems reasonable.
Right. It's like they say, it's not always what you say, it's how you say it.
Exactly.
But in this case, it feels like they're really using that to their advantage.
Yeah.
Interpreting every pause and every inflection as evidence to support their argument.
Exactly. And I think it's important to remember that we're seeing all of this through a very specific lens. We're seeing it through this commentator's lens.
You're right.
They have chosen these clips, they've highlighted these moments, and they are interpreting them in a way that fits the argument that they want to make.
Right.
And it's up to us as viewers to decide, do we agree with that interpretation, or is there another way to look at this?
Right. It's a good reminder to be really critical consumers of this information.
Yeah.
And not just take one person's word for it, even if they present themselves as an expert. Do your own research. Look at things from multiple angles and come to your own conclusions.
Couldn't agree more. And I think this particular commentary is a perfect example of why that's so important, because it's not just about policy disagreements. They also get into some very pointed personal critiques, particularly about Harris's communication style.
Okay.
So they suggest that she relies on overly complex language almost as a way to mask a lack of substance.
Okay.
And they even play a clip of her discussing Iran and Israel as supposed evidence of this.
Yeah, that was an interesting segment because they really seem to struggle to follow her explanation. And they frame it as if it's, convoluted and confusing. And it made me wonder, are they intentionally misinterpreting what she's saying, or do they genuinely just not understand the nuances of the issue?
It's really hard to say for sure without hearing the full context of the interview and her responses, but I think it does bring up a really important question about the role of commentators in general.
Right.
Are they there to provide objective analysis, or are they more interested in pushing a particular agenda?
Right.
And if it's the latter, how does that shape the way they present information and interpret these events?
Right, like we were talking about before, being aware of those underlying biases.
Yeah.
Because those biases are going to influence everything from, the topics that they choose to cover to the way that they frame those topics, even down to the guests that they have on their shows.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that even something that seems as straightforward as a news report or a political commentary is still a constructed narrative. Someone is making choices about what to include, what to leave out, how to present this information to the audience.
It's like that awareness that there's a director behind the camera, even if you can't see them, their presence is still felt in every single frame of that film.
Love that analogy. And just like with a film, it's really up to us as viewers to be active participants in that process, to question what we're seeing and hearing and form our own interpretations.
Right. And speaking of interpretations, this commentator seems particularly fixated on one recurring theme throughout their analysis, and that's Biden's age and mental fitness.
Yeah, they keep coming back to that, don't they?
They do, and they're very critical of Harris for not directly addressing those concerns, as if she's either in denial or deliberately evading the issue.
Right.
They even go so far as to say, everybody sees it, implying that his cognitive decline is like obvious and undeniable, and it just felt like a very bold statement to make without really providing any concrete evidence to support that.
It's a very dangerous line to walk, because while it's certainly fair to raise questions about a candidate's health and their fitness for office, I think it's important to do so in a way that is respectful and avoids veering into potentially harmful stereotypes about aging.
Right. It's about finding that balance between expressing legitimate concerns and not just making, ageist assumptions.
Exactly. And I'm not sure this commentator always struck that balance effectively.
Yeah.
It felt like they were more interested in using his age as a weapon against him and Harris than actually engaging in a nuanced discussion about the challenges and realities of aging and leadership roles.
Yeah, it's almost like they're trying to tap into this pre-existing anxiety or prejudice that some people might have about older adults in positions of power.
Which is a very common tactic, unfortunately. It's playing on people's fears and insecurities rather than appealing to, their better judgment.
Which is why it's so important to be aware of these tactics and to be critical thinkers and not just accept everything that we hear at face value.
Be your own fact checker, be your own media critic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So then they take this whole age argument a step further and they start contrasting Biden with Trump,
Okay.
suggesting that Trump's popularity is somehow evidence that he's mentally sharper than Biden.
Which, of course, is a totally illogical argument to make. Right. Because political popularity, as we've discussed, is this incredibly complex thing influenced by a multitude of factors.
So many things.
It's not just about a candidate's, perceived mental acuity, and to suggest that is incredibly reductive.
Yeah, it's like saying the most popular kid in school is automatically the smartest.
Exactly. There's no correlation there.
None whatsoever. To be fair, though, the commentator does attempt to at least unpack some of those other factors that might be contributing to Trump's popularity.
Okay.
Specifically focusing on what they perceive as this difference in energy and enthusiasm between their supporters.
Right.
So they talk about, the size and the energy of Trump's rallies, and they contrast that with what they characterize as a more subdued or less enthusiastic atmosphere at Biden and Harris events.
Yeah, and they even showed that clip, right, comparing the packed Megan Thee Stallion concert with the less densely populated Harris rally.
And I feel like that's where their analysis really takes a turn.
Yeah, that felt a little uncomfortable.
It did, because it almost felt like they were suggesting that one of the reasons Harris struggles to draw a crowd is because she's a woman.
Right.
And more specifically, a woman of color.
Right.
And they contrast her with Megan Thee Stallion's popularity, and it just felt a little iffy.
Yeah, because it plays into this idea that certain demographics are only interested in entertainment, not in serious political discourse.
Right.
And I think that's not only an inaccurate generalization, but it also perpetuates these really harmful stereotypes about who is and isn't engaged in the political process.
Absolutely. It's a good reminder that we have to be so careful about the comparisons we make and the narratives that we perpetuate, even unintentionally.
Yeah.
Because even a seemingly harmless observation can be loaded with these implicit biases.
Absolutely. And it's our responsibility to be aware of those biases, challenge them when we see them, and demand better from the commentators and the media outlets that we choose to engage with.
Well said. All right, so let's shift gears a little bit here and talk about how this commentator ultimately wraps up their analysis. So after they go through all of these different points, from the policy disagreements to her demeanor to her communication style, what's kind of the final takeaway? Where do they land on her performance overall?
Well, to put it bluntly, they do not hold back on the criticism.
Okay.
They basically say that this interview was a complete dumpster fire, that she came across as unprepared, evasive, out of touch, and, they use some pretty strong language.
Yeah, I was going to say that phrase dumpster fire really stood out to me. It's very it's very evocative imagery, right?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's the point. It's inflammatory language. It's designed to get a reaction out of you. It's not about being nuanced or thoughtful or, really engaging with the substance of what was said.
Right.
It's about creating a spectacle. It's about stirring up outrage and ultimately trying to control the narrative.
And it feels like that's a tactic that's being used more and more these days in political commentary in general.
Oh, for sure.
It's almost like the entertainment value has kind of superseded the need for, substantive analysis.
Yeah, and it's something we have to be really careful about because it's very easy to get caught up in the drama, the outrage, the dumpster fire, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
But if we really want to be informed citizens, we need to be able to see past those tactics and engage with the actual issues at hand.
Engage with the substance.
Exactly. So I think a good question to always ask yourself when you're consuming this type of content is, what is the commentator's goal here?
It's a great question.
Are they trying to inform me, or are they trying to manipulate me? And once you start asking that question, I think you start to see these commentaries for what they really are, which is a very carefully constructed narrative designed to elicit a very specific response.
It's about being aware of that intention.
Right. Exactly.
So with all that in mind, what's your advice for our listeners as they're kind of navigating this world of political commentary, especially with, an election on the horizon?
Don't be passive consumers of information. Don't just take one person's word for it. Even if they seem credible, even if they have a big platform.
Lots of followers.
Exactly. Seek out multiple perspectives, different viewpoints, and most importantly, think for yourself.
Don't let somebody else tell you what to think. Be
Exactly.
your own judge. Be your own jury.
I love that.
And that's really what we're trying to do in this deep dive, right? We're not here to tell you what to think about this commentator or their take on Kamala Harris's interview.
Right.
We're here to unpack some of those layers, the tactics at play, the potential biases, and then let you, the listener, come to your own conclusions.
Exactly. We just want to give you a framework for thinking critically about this stuff because it can be really overwhelming,
It can be a lot.
especially in today's world.
So to our listeners, we always encourage you to seek out the full interview for yourselves. Don't just take this commentator's word for it.
Please.
Don't even just take our word for it. Hear it directly from the source, analyze it with a critical eye, and then form your own opinions.
That's all we can ask.
Because in the end, that's what really matters, right?
Absolutely.
Engaging with this information, critically thinking for yourselves, and then participating in our democracy in a meaningful way.
Beautifully said.
And on that note, we'll leave you with this. How much do these types of commentaries, these breakdowns, these, really strong opinions, how much do they actually influence public perception, especially in our current media landscape?
It's a great question.
It's something to think about as you're scrolling through your feeds, as you're, watching these videos online, because one thing's for sure, this conversation is far from over.